Hello and welcome to a lesson on social influence, also called social psychology. And this is number 7 on the specification. It's called the Authoritarian Personality. And this is particularly looking at why people will obey according to their particular personality type. And we're going to use something called the F scale. So F stands for fascism, which we'll discuss in a moment. And before you start, you will have already completed an online personality questionnaire to see about your political views. So if you haven't done that, if you could do that now, check your emails for a link. So before we really get into it, if we're looking at political views, we really need to understand a little bit about politics. This isn't on spec, it's kind of assumed that you have this knowledge, but over the years I found that maybe some people don't have political knowledge. So very quickly, this is my beautiful political butterfly. And if you look at it, we can see the body of the butterfly, and on the left wing it says Labour, and on the right wing it says Conservative, and then in the middle it says Lib Dem. And the colours represent the political parties of the UK. So in the UK, we've got the Labour Party, which is traditionally left-wing and has views like that everybody should be looked after by the government. We've got something called the welfare state, which provides benefits and it provides support for anybody who might need it. The government will also provide schooling and NHS. And so the idea of left-wing traditional politics is that the government plays quite a strong role in your life in terms that it will scoop you up and help you if you need support. So if you're ill, or if you've had a baby and need maternity pay, or if you have a disability and you need income because you can't work because of your disability, all of this is kind of left-wing politics. It's the idea that everybody that can will pay into the government through their taxes, and therefore the government will use everybody's taxes to provide for the nation, and so everybody therefore should be able to be independent and be well looked after. That's the idea of traditional left-wing politics. At the moment in the UK, we don't have a Labour government, we have a Conservative government, which in today's lesson, as I'm teaching this in October 2020, it's Boris Johnson who's the Prime Minister, and he is right-wing. So traditionally, you can look at the butterfly, Conservative colour is blue, and traditionally the Conservative Party don't want the government to play such a huge role in your life. Ideally, they want to tax people less so that you've got more money yourself to provide for services that you might need. And so therefore they're in favour of things like privatisation. They would favour private schools, all the energy supplies are private, that the railways and public transport, all of that is privately run. So in the Labour government, all of that would be run by the government traditionally. So the Conservative Party believe that everybody should be responsible for themselves, and ideally pay for all the services that they need. And if someone is poorly, then their family would have enough money to look after them and the government wouldn't have to intervene so much. Now, of course, we do have the welfare state and the government will provide, but we're looking at their ideology. What do the Conservative Party believe in? So they believe that you should earn as much as you possibly can, and they will hopefully tax you less so that you've got enough money to provide everything. The right-wing government traditionally are very in favour of charities, because a charity means that the government isn't providing money and support to individuals who need it, but that the individual charity is. And of course we know that charities do great work and they've got specialist knowledge of very particular things. Now, left-wing government does agree with charity, but they would be providing the support. But charitable organisations do go with both sides, but it's the right-wing view that they would be really important. In the middle, you've got Lib Dems. Now, I don't know a huge amount about Lib Dems, but they're in the middle of the two, and they are in my political butterfly. You can see they're a much smaller section, and that's because traditionally, throughout history in the UK, the political party in power will either be Labour or Lib Dem, and not very often will it, traditionally it'll either be Labour or Conservative, and traditionally we haven't seen many Liberal Democrats who are in charge. In 2010 they formed a coalition government with the Conservatives, but then they were soon dropped and a lot of people didn't like what was going on. Anyway, so That's very, very basic politics, but you will notice on my political butterfly, they've got the antennae coming out of the butterfly. And so when the antennae come out, the little blobs on the end, they go into an extreme version. So if you are extremely right wing, then you would be a member of the far right political movement. And those people take conservatism to a very extreme level. So you might know about movements in the UK, such as Britain First. That's a far right movement, and it takes conservative ideas and makes it really extreme. So it's saying that they've got very strict laws on things like immigration. They don't want anybody else coming to the UK because they don't want to provide for anybody at all. They want people to look after their own. Also on the far right, we would have seen parties in history. You will have heard of fascist parties such as the Nazi Party. That is a far right political movement, and of course we know about the terrible things that occurred under the Nazis, and that was because they were so extreme in their views that they wanted to destroy anybody who didn't believe in their views. You've also got far left groups which are equally arguably difficult. So a communist party would be far left, and in history you will have seen communist parties like that used to be in Russia, and of course these extreme views also cause problems. So people will suffer under extreme political ideologies because under communism it was agreed that everybody would be equal, which is a really nice idea, but in practice it just meant there was a lot of poverty and suffering and there was corruption. So extremist views are quite dangerous on far left and far right. And what we're looking at today is the far right. So we're looking at something called the authoritarian personality. And if you have an authoritarian personality, it means that you're going to be extremely right wing and have very, very traditional and extremist right wing views. And the really strange bit that we're looking at today is that if you have an authoritarian personality, then it will affect your obedience in life. So the unit is called social influence. We're looking at obedience, and if you have a far right wing personality, then you are likely to be extremely obedient because you believe that you believe in the power of legitimate authority. If you think about the Nazi Party, they believed that, well, they had to obey all the commands that were given to them. So that's what we're looking at today. So the whole thing, the authoritarian personality, is why do we obey? And the authoritarian personality says that obedience is not situational. It's not about the situation you're in that causes you to obey. It's your disposition. It's your personality. Some people are more obedient because they have a personality or a disposition that is more obedient, and we call it the authoritarian personality. So the authoritarian personality, as I've said, it's not the situation that makes us obey, it's something about our personality. But where does it come from and how do you measure it? So Adorno, and you don't need to remember his name, but Adorno in the 1950s used the California F scale to measure components of the authoritarian personality. And the California F scale, F stands for fascist. And that, when we say fascist, we're talking about far right extreme views. And if you're not sure about fascism, from what I've said about the Nazis, then Google it now and just make sure that you're aware of what fascism is. So Adorno used the California F scale, and all of you would have completed that questionnaire online, and it would have given you a score and to explain to you how right wing you are. And the idea is that the more right wing you are, more fascist you are, the more obedient you will be. So what was your F score? Think about the questions that the F quiz asked. So one of the questions in the personality questionnaire you did on the California F scale, one of the things that you had to agree or disagree with was obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. And you were asked to either agree strongly or disagree strongly with statements like that. And if you agreed strongly with statements like that, then the idea is that you will score quite highly on right-wing authoritarianism because you see the world in quite a black and white way. And people who score very highly on the F scale, they want to enforce strict social rules and hierarchies. So they want to see the world in black and white. That makes things easier for them. And when you look at that statement, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. So if you agree with that, you are right wing, but you might have other thoughts. So one of my thoughts on this is, well, actually, one of the best virtues for children to learn is about kindness and sharing and empathy. And so I wouldn't personally strongly agree with that statement, because I don't think that obedience is the most important virtue for a child. So the authoritarian personality use the S scale to measure certain components of the authoritarian personality, and to identify how right-wing authoritarian people are. And then we can apply that to understand about obedience. People who are right-wing authoritarian require very little pressure to obey. If there's a legitimate authority figure, then their personality will tell them to obey that person no matter what they're being asked to do. So where does it come from? What causes it? And Adorno claimed that people who were high on the F scale, so right-wing authoritarian, were brought up by strict parents who used a very strict parenting style, including the use of punishment. And this is a really important thing to make a note on, because it's saying that if you've got an authoritarian personality, this personality is developed from childhood. You've internalized this strict upbringing and it's become part of who you are. And so you grow up with the idea that you have to obey legitimate authority, because if you don't, there will be consequences such as physical punishment. And then another aspect of this are looking at the cluster of right-wing authoritarian personality variables. So Altemeyer in 1981, he took the authoritarian personality and he identified that people who are right-wing authoritarian, or RWA, will have these three personality characteristics. So they will be high on something called conventionalism, they'll be high in authoritarian aggression, and high in authoritarian submission. And so conventionalism means an adherence to conventional norms and values. And what that means is that if you are conventional, you are very, very traditional. So you wouldn't dye your hair purple, and you wouldn't be late to class, and you'd have a lot of very traditional views. You wouldn't want to stand out, and you wouldn't like venture out of the little box that you've been put yourself in. So people who are conventional will do things that are traditional. So for example, getting married and having children is a very traditional idea, and people who are high on conventionalism would get married and have children even if they didn't want to. Even if they never wanted to get married, they would do it because they want to be conventional. They would have children even if they didn't want them, because that's what people do in traditional society. And it would go a bit further as well. Supposing somebody was gay or bisexual or didn't have a straight sexual orientation, they would marry somebody as if they were straight, because sexuality, the traditional sexuality, and the one that is most common, is heterosexuality. And so they wouldn't want to step out of that box and come out as being gay or bisexual or anything. So they would get married to someone of the opposite sex, have children with them, but they would be living their whole life not actually fulfilling their actual desires. So you can see that if you're very right wing, you stick to traditional and conventional values very strictly, even if it doesn't fit with who you are as a person. People who are high RWA, right wing authoritarian, will display authoritarian aggression. And what that means is they're going to have aggressive feelings towards people who violate traditional norms and values. So it explains why some people are very discriminatory and will be very abusive to people who are not traditional. So you might get people, you see like hate crimes to do with racism, sexuality, religion. Anybody who doesn't fit into the traditional values of that particular culture, they will display aggression towards those people. So if someone decided to dye their hair purple and green, they would be tutting at that and saying, oh, what do they think they're doing? They'll never get a proper job if they've got stupid hair like that. They'll be very angry towards them, and they will actually, in some circumstances, direct hate crimes towards those people. And it's a really sad state of affairs that we still do see racist crimes and sexuality crimes where people will attack people verbally and physically because they're not the same as them. Somebody who's high on authoritarianism will have an authoritarian submission element to their personality, and that simply means that they will show uncritical submission to legitimate authority figures. So if a legitimate authority figure told them to do something, they would do it without question. So obviously we know people in society who have legitimate authority tend to be people like police officers, perhaps solicitors, teachers, people who've got like a qualification behind them. Especially police officers, then if someone told them to do something, they would do it immediately and they wouldn't question that authority, even if what they were being told to do didn't suit them. So those are the three characteristics of somebody with an authoritarian personality. And on handout SP10, which you can find in MS Teams under Files, you can just summarise those points now using that handout, and you can also summarise the 4 questions before it about what the authoritarian personality is. So the last part of description about the authoritarian personality is some research that was done by Altemeyer. Of course, you don't need to remember his name, but he's a researcher who tested the relationship between RWA, Right Wing Authoritarianism, and obedience in a correlational investigation where participants were ordered to give themselves increasing levels of shock when they made mistakes on a learning task. And what Altemeyer found was that there was a significant correlation between right-wing authoritarian scores and the level of shocks that participants were willing to give themselves. So if the experimenter was telling you to do something, people who scored high on the F scale, who are right-wing authoritarian, they would do it. They would give themselves really painful electric shocks every time they didn't get an answer correct. But people who are not right-wing authoritarian, people with more left-wing views, they would actually question the authority figure and say no. So let's do some research methodology practice. Could you pause the video here and sketch an appropriate graph to represent Altemeyer's findings? And you need to decide what kind of graph you're going to draw. Remember, this is a correlation. Identify the 2 covariables and write a directional hypothesis. And remember, this will be a correlational hypothesis. Once you've done that, hopefully you've drawn a scattergram to show a positive correlation between the covariables of right-wing authoritarianism and the number of shocks a person would give themselves. And so that means that your scattergram should be a diagonal line up to the right. And what we're saying is that the more right-wing authoritarian you are, the more shocks you will give yourself. So there's a positive relationship between those 2 things. The more of one covariable, the more of another. So the last part of the description is for you to outline Elms and Milgram's follow-up study from 1966. So use handout SP10 and use page 28 of your textbook to read about the follow-up study that Elms and Milgram did. And this was a follow-up study to the original Milgram experiment on with the electric shock experiment. The follow-up study was where Milgram and Elms interviewed the participants who took part in the original study to find out about their personality. So if you could outline the procedure and the findings of that study. Okay, when it comes to evaluation, I would like you to use a handout called SP35, which you can find on MS Teams under Files, and you'll see it's a big sheet of A3 that's split into 3. And the evaluation points are on page 29 of your textbook. The first evaluation point is research done by Dan Brunn and Vatanay, and it's the first paragraph on page 29. And it provides research support for the idea of the authoritarian personality. So read that evaluation point and then summarize it and create something meaningful, like a little picture or diagram or something to illustrate your point on that handout. The second evaluation is the second paragraph on page 29, and it's about the fact, it's a criticism of the authoritarian personality as an explanation for obedience, because it says the social context is more important. And this is where you use Milgram's variations to show that if obedience changed when we changed the situation, when we changed the context, then that tells us it's not your personality that's causing you to obey, it's something about the situation. And we already know about Milgram's variations, so use a little bit of that information you had from last week to provide evidence that the social context is more important. The third evaluation point is about education, and that education may determine authoritarianism and obedience. So this is also on page 29, but it's in the top right hand corner of page 29. If it's the 4th edition, if it's the 5th edition, I think it's the 4th paragraph. But you're looking for the research by Middendorp and Melion that is talking about that your education might be the factor that is causing obedience rather than purely your right-wing views. So if you summarise those evaluation points on that handout SP35, once you've done that, those are the 3 evaluation points that you would need if you had a 12-mark essay question on the exam that said outline and evaluate the authoritarian personality. So the 3 evaluation points would help you provide a discussion for whether the authoritarian personality is a good explanation for why people obey. I will put the directed study onto MS Teams, but there's basically a multiple choice quiz, and I recommend that you do the can you questions on page 29 as well, just so that you can consolidate your knowledge. Thank you very much.